Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and this is a look at passive transport, specifically looking at passive transport that occurs in the cell. If we want to start a discussion of passive transport, we start with homeostasis. Homeostasis is keeping the internal environment the same, even though the external environment changes. You can see a different definition here on the screen. This is a more book-type definition. I like to think of internal environment stays the same even though the external environment changes, because that's the world that we live in. We live in a changing environment, and your cells have to keep a certain range of conditions to survive. And one of the ways they control that range of conditions inside is through a selectively permeable cell membrane. So to start this discussion then, we would look at diffusion. The movement of a substance from high concentration to low concentration. And in diffusion, this doesn't require any energy to take place. So when we're talking about a cell membrane, we're talking about the movement across the cell membrane that does not require energy. That would be what we call, and you can see it right here, passive transport. Passive transport is, think of it like going on a bike ride. So you have a high concentration or a hill and a low concentration on the other side of that membrane, or that cell membrane. So when I'm riding my bike, if I get to the top of a hill and I start to go down that hill, I don't have to put any energy into going down the hill other than just staying on the bike and holding the brake every once in a while. But the bike will go downhill without me pedaling. I don't have to put any energy into it. So that's the same in the cell. So you get what we call a concentration gradient, where you've got more concentration of a certain molecule on one side, less on another side. So you get these two concentrations, and in this case there would be a membrane in between here. And those molecules are naturally going to want to go from high to low, down the hill. No energy required. Eventually, as they go downhill, they will level this out to where there'll be equal amounts of molecules on both sides of the membrane. And this is called equilibrium. And you've experienced this if you've ever been in a room and they've sprayed some kind of air freshener or perfume. As you're sitting in that room, you might feel, or not feel, but smell that air freshener as it comes through. At first maybe it's just a little hint, and then it's stronger and stronger until eventually it kind of goes away. You don't smell it anymore. But if you leave the room, come back into the room, there's a good chance you would smell that air freshener. And that's because it's reached equilibrium to you and your senses in the room. There's not necessarily one area of the room that is more strong in scent than another, but the scent is kind of equally spread out throughout the room. So the movement of those substances for that air freshener is from high concentration to low concentration in the room. That is simply called diffusion. So when we look at diffusion in the cell, many substances, such as molecules and ions that are dissolved outside the cell and inside the cell, are having to be transported through that cell membrane. Now, some of them are able to just go directly through the cell membrane, but for that to happen, they really have to be small and many times non-charged or uncharged so that they can get through that lipid area of the cell membrane. We've talked about that in class. One such molecule that has to diffuse across the cell membrane is called water, and that process of diffusion of water through that cell membrane is called osmosis. Now, water is unable to go directly through the cell membrane, and this was something that was thought incorrectly for a while. Now we know that water diffuses across the cell membrane through proteins called aquaporins. The direction of water movement across the cell membrane depends on the relative concentrations of free water. So free water always goes from high concentration of free water to low concentration. Now, free water may be a new concept. So what you have to think about with free water is if I took a bunch of sugar and I dumped it into water and I mixed it up, eventually I could get all of that sugar to disappear, depending on how much sugar I dumped in there. Well, what's happening is that water is interacting with that sugar, and it's spreading that sugar out until you can't see it anymore. So some of that water is having to interact with that sugar. Some of that water is not interacting with the sugar. The water that's not interacting with the sugar we call free water. The water that's interacting with the sugar is not free because it's interacting with sugar. So when we talk about the movement of water, if you think about a membrane and you've got a lot of free water out here and not a lot of free water in here, then water would go this direction until there's equal amounts of free water on both sides of the membrane. Let's look at some examples. So when we see this, here we've got a hypertonic solution. A hypertonic solution causes the cell to shrink. So, for instance, if we took your red blood cells, let's say, because that's what's in the picture here, and we put those red blood cells in a solution that had a high amount of, let's say, salt water, because salt water is one of those things, if you're on an island and you're drinking the water in the ocean, you can dehydrate. This is the reason. So if you add salt water to your body, you're adding water, but it's bound up to the salt molecules. And there's not a lot of free water floating around out here. It's all bound up over here with the salt. So when your cells interact with it, your cells have more free water. So high free water on the inside of the cell, low free water outside the cell. Water moves out of the cell or across that cell membrane, and that causes the cell then to shrink, like you can see in the picture. A hypotonic solution is a solution that will cause the cell to swell. So this would be why if I go into the hospital and I'm dehydrated, I need water in my cells. That's really what dehydration is, you've lost too much water. Well, when they give me an IV, they don't just put distilled water straight into my veins. The reason is that would be 100% free water. Your cells are not 100% free water. In fact, at the point of dehydration, they're very, very low free water. Water would rush into those cells and eventually burst them, or lyse them is what that's called, and it creates a hypotonic environment where the cell is going to swell and burst in animals. Now, in plants, this is what they want. They want a hypotonic environment because they're going to swell, but because they have that cell wall around them, they're just going to get real tight. And this is why if you walk around the produce section of a store like Walmart or Kroger, when they mist their vegetables with water, because it causes them to keep swelled up and tight. You know, when you pick up a piece of celery, you don't want it to flop over and be all wilted. That's gross. You wouldn't buy that. You want it to have that rigidity so that when you bite that piece of celery, it gives it that nice crunch. That is a hypotonic environment where water will fill those cells and expand those cells, make them real tight. There are environments then also that you could go with that are isotonic. Isotonic have equal amounts of free water on both sides, and water moves back and forth. This will be what happens if the environment is not too extreme. Be it hypotonic or hypertonic, eventually an isotonic environment will be created unless it's so extreme that the cell shrinks to it can't shrink anymore and dies, or it blows up to the point that it bursts. If it doesn't do that, then it will eventually reach an isotonic environment where water will move in, but water will also move out because the free water is equal on both sides of the cell membrane. Most ion and polar molecules cannot just go across the cell membrane, so they use what we call transport proteins. Transport proteins are channels that provide polar passageways through which ions and polar molecules can move across the cell membrane. So ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, those are very important to the functioning of your cell. They have to get in and out of the cell, and to do so, they need an ion channel. This is a kind of, you can think of a donut-shaped transport protein that allows the movement through, or a tunnel that you have to, like, if you were driving up in Gatlinburg and you go from Gatlinburg to Pigeon Forge, there's a tunnel to drive through the mountain. That's kind of what's going on here. These ions are just traveling through a tunnel. Ion channel gates, some of them have gates where they can open and close them so that the cell can dictate whether those ions are able to go out. You want to store some ions in the cell, and then other ions you want to keep out until certain environments are right. And then when the environment is right, they'll open that gate and allow that diffusion to take place to do whatever the cell needs to be done. So we look at the last thing here is called facilitated diffusion. So in this case, it's a protein that carries a molecule, but it doesn't require energy to carry it. And this is confusing for some students because they think of carrying requires work. If I carry something into the house from the car, that requires work to do so. But in this case, it would be kind of like carrying a cotton ball. It doesn't. I still walk into the house, and that cotton ball adds no more strain or stress to me. It's not really requiring any energy. So it's carrying across the cell membrane, but it's still passive transport. It's facilitating that passage by carrying it across, but it doesn't require energy. It goes from a high concentration to a low concentration, so it's still in the category of what we call passive transport.